we are going to begin the show. Tristan was nice enough to endure my technical shift, but today it is all about him and what he does and his perspective. Somewhat I may interject here and there. Other than that, it's really a great conversation about Black professionals and how the job search is different for us collectively. And really, I think those, because of the pandemic, those problems has been accentuated. But I want to welcome Tristan Layfield to the show. He's a LinkedIn Top Voice 2020. His website, layfieldresume.com. Is that correct? Did I get that right? Layfieldresume.com. Layfield Resume Consulting is his company. You definitely want to get with him. He is a career coach, resume writer. He also is able to talk about any job search topic you want to talk about. He does career coaching, cover letters, resume revamp, LinkedIn profiles. He's also a speaker and workshop facilitator. Thank you very much for joining me, Tristan.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Sure. This is great because, and it's great we're able to talk about this in an open forum. And I want you guys to comment in the thread and also share it if you get a chance to. If you want to keep it to yourself, that's okay too. But definitely we want to try to have a candid discussion about why it's different. And I think because of, as I was talking about, COVID has made it quite obvious that there's a difference between those who have access and those who not. I'll give an example, and then we can kind of fly off of there. There is obvious, of course, because of the job market and the way the job market is built, that some are able to go remote than others. Unfortunately, those who can't, Black people are affected the most. And there was a study where a lot of us are considered essential workers for whatever. And yes, we could be doctors, nurses, but largely in part, that's not what some of the stats were actually talking about, because we're a larger part of the service industries, the hotel industries, the travel industries, and some of those industries got crushed. Not completely, but it definitely affected a lot of us. So, Tristan, you can feel free to fill in the blanks where I might have even left off at this particular point.
Yeah, so I think it really starts at looking at what type of opportunities we've had access to, right? When Black adults make up 0.8% of Fortune 500 CEOs, we make up 3.2% of executive or senior level officials and managers. We sort of understand that there's a very large disparity in who has access to high wage positions, which when you look at the data, only about 9.2% of workers in the lowest quartile of wage distribution are able to work from home, whereas 61.5% of workers in the highest quartile of wage distribution are able to work from home, right? So if you even just look at that disparity in numbers when it comes to the positions that we have access to and that we currently hold and maintain versus the positions that are actually able to work from home, it's very clear that a large percentage of Black, workers are going to have to actually risk their health and go out and work because, as you said, many of us are essential workers. So I think it's something larger to be said here, right? Those racial disparities inside of the workplace are really, really being exacerbated by this pandemic. And it's very clear in the data that's being shown when only 19.7%, I believe, it's like 1 in 5 Black people are able to work from home. And when we look at some of our other counterparts where that number is much, much higher, it's either the highest, I think, is like a third of the Asian population is able to work from home. About nearly a third of white people are able to work from home. We're talking about 1 in 5 Black workers. And if you extrapolate that out to Hispanic workers, it's 1 in 6, right? So there's a very clear disparity in who's able to actually enjoy the comforts of being home during this time and who's not.
Well, we can also tie some of the in some kind of interpolated way, you can tie pay disparities along with the disparities we see in the workplace and how that's really affected Black people. And still, if you look at like pay scale and so many other studies, Asians are well paid.
Mhm.
Uh, and some even show they're better paid than white males, as
Mhm.
opposed to uh, Black people are on the shorter edge of that pay scale. Uh, I think they were measuring Asians at $1.15 uh, compared to white male at $1, and then Black people uh, somewhere around the 79 percentile if you're averaging out men and women. Women,
Mhm.
it's even lower. Black women, especially.
Yeah.
So therefore, we have to look at it a little bit differently. And I think that as Black people, trying to encourage them, and you do, and I do, in taking a lot more thoughtful approach to their job search, as far as how they're doing it and what they're looking at, and those kind of things. So
Mhm.
while that bulk of the research, I know, like you and like we say, do it before you start looking. That way you won't get caught with your pants down. And also don't expect so much that people will be accommodating, but they won't be, even if you like the company.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. The best time to start a job search is day one of when you start your new job. Right? You should always act as if you're on the market, because at the end of the day, companies are always going to do what's in their best interest, right? And
Right.
so, one of the things that we know based on all the data that we've seen, even like dating back to the 1930s all the way up to now, is
Hmm.
that Black people are often the last hired but the first fired, right? So
Yeah.
when our economy is looking up, we're typically the last people to actually get the job, but as soon as our economy takes a downturn, we're typically some of the first people to go. So it's
Yeah.
imperative that we start to look out for our own best interests and make sure that we're always vetting out opportunities for ourselves, always having something that is potentially there on the table, or always making connections with people who could potentially help get us to the places where we want to go. So that way, like you said, we won't get caught with our pants down. The other thing is, when we look at our job search, we have to sort of realize what job search tactics work versus what job search tactics actually give you a feeling that you're doing work rather than actually being effective, right? So
Right.
what I mean by that is you can apply online till the cows come home. And we have to. It's an essential part of the job search process. But at the end of the
Hmm.
day, in the United States, depending on the type of studies that you look at, you have anywhere from about a 2 to 5% chance of landing a role by applying online. Let's just be
Right.
very frank and honest about it. So, while we need to do that, we need to look at what other methods really work. And one method that works for all people, but specifically works really well for Black professionals, is developing and leveraging a network. Right. So
Hmm.
we should be having mentors. We should also be figuring out people who are sponsors for us, right? People who will advocate for us when we're not in rooms. Figuring out people who are willing to actually help us and develop those relationships with those people, because at the end of the day, you're 15 times more likely to land a role but through networking or referrals than you are through applying online.
Yes.
And we know that 80% of 75 to 80% of jobs are filled through networking and referrals. And that, so oftentimes what that does is that puts Black people specifically at a disadvantage oftentimes, right? We're usually not as well connected in a lot of these spaces, right?
Hmm.
And so if you aren't as well connected, oftentimes your name's not going to be the thing that's brought up, right? People are not necessarily going to refer you just off the strength, right? We don't have family members that oftentimes that work in these companies, or tons of friends that work in these companies. So it's imperative that we start to build relationships with people who work at places we want to work at, who hold positions that we want to hold, who are 1 to 2 levels above where we want to go. So that way, once the time comes, we already have those relationships. It doesn't feel like we're using them simply to get a job, but they
Right.
become a resource once you do need that opportunity. And I think
Mhm.
that's really important for people to know, because I often get a lot of Black job seekers. I would say the majority of my clientele, for the most part, are Black and brown. I would say a
Mhm.
good 65% of that is Black women. And I know that the majority of the time we're looking for resumes to actually just start the application process. And that is not the most efficient and effective way for us to get to where we're trying to go.
Right. Everywhere I think, realizing that everywhere we have to go and any point we have to make, there's going to, or any way we can get attention is going to disrupt. Uh, it has to disrupt the interview and the hiring process in some kind of way.
Mhm.
Because going through the ATS, applying to a whole bunch of positions, just really. It really doesn't work for anybody,
Mhm.
much less for us, especially when we're mass applying. So there is need to be some kind of thoughtfulness that would need to be approached. To start from the beginning. I mean, start everything from the beginning. Start
Mhm.
investigating salary information. Start investigating who you really need to connect with. Not that they look good, but this also start the relationship as well. And all of that, ideally, you want to start before you actually hit the road. You need everything that you basically need to know. You want to start. You want to start at the beginning. Even the ideal company, having a list of target companies, having those kind of things, so that when you connect with somebody, you're connecting with somebody who's on your target list, not because that you're able to have a great conversation with. Great conversations are okay, but you want a great conversation with somebody that is a part of your network that could get in. And now I'm not saying don't connect with people just because. What I'm
Mhm.
saying is be thoughtful about where you begin, because lots determine on how you're going to need to pivot. What if you find out middle of the process that you don't like the industry anymore?
Yes.
Then you can either feel like you start from the beginning or you can just pivot.
Yep. Yep.
And I think
Absolutely.
a lot of people got stuck last fall, last not just last fall, last
Spring. Yeah.
winter, really, because it all started to hit the fan the end of April, I mean, end of February. And I remember distinctly that people were still trying to think that, oh, nothing's going to happen, somebody's going to come save me, and there's nobody to save us.
No, no, there isn't.
Yeah.
So I did see that Christopher over at LinkedIn asked to clarify terminology. Do you seek a sponsor as a job seeker or as an employee looking to advance in their career,
Yeah,
or
that was a
both?
Christopher Taylor. I got you. Yeah, great.
So that's a really great question. So it would be more of a sponsor if you are inside of a company or organization. Not to say you can't necessarily have sponsors outside of the organizations as well, right? But typically, what I tend to call those people outside of the organizations are boosters or super boosters.
Mhm.
Boosters are people who can have some weight inside of their company, can potentially, provide you that type of referral that you need. Super boosters are people who have influence inside of the industry beyond their company, right? So they
Mhm.
could potentially help you get into the field that you're trying to get into, maybe at their company, but maybe somewhere else. So that's a really good clarifying question, Christopher. I think it really comes down to semantics. We're really looking for the same thing: is someone who believes in your ability to do the job, to do the work, and is willing to advocate for you in spaces that you aren't currently in.
Yeah,
That's really
and if somebody can speak on your behalf and
Yeah.
even could directly influence you getting that next level job, that person would be a sponsor as well. That
Yep.
somebody will have a sort of a direct or indirect influence of the way that you're able to get to that next level. But that's a good
Yep.
point about sponsorship is that I was a benefactor of having a sponsorship on a couple of occasions where they were able to advocate for me why I should have this next position, and
Hmm.
then I was able to get it. As opposed to mentors, they're just the ones who are kind of giving you the feedback that you need to add to your intel that will help
Hmm.
you get to the next level.
Yep. Yep. And another thing I would say too, there's another category of people that I think is important for people to build up. And I don't think as standard job seekers, we often think this, but building up your fan base. You should have fans as somebody who works in a company.
Yeah.
People who love the work you do, rave about the work you do. Those people can actually be quite influential inside of this process too, even if they aren't actively advocating on your behalf for a specific role. You'll find that they play their particular role inside of this too. But as you said, I've benefited from having a sponsor inside of an organization as well, who, they even helped me land an interview for a position that the company wasn't willing to give me initially,
Mhm.
because I hadn't been in my current role for a year, right? But they were like, oh, I don't care about that. Here's his skill set. He's able to do the job, and we need
Yeah.
someone who can do the job, right?
Right.
And so they will advocate for you in certain ways. And I didn't even know fully that he was doing that. He was doing it sort of behind the scenes without me even fully knowing. And then next thing I know, I got the interview. Um,
I had a very similar experience as somebody spoke on my behalf. They didn't want to give it at first. It took a while, but then when I finally got it, it was became a revelation that I can do that then some, because of circumstances, what have you. But I think ultimately, yeah, somebody who can really speak to someone that will influence the process is the bigger deal than the
mhm,
somebody who would just be able to talk on your behalf. And I think that's the difference, because if you have those relationships transfer to
mhm.
that next person up. And then
Yep.
you can start to have those conversations with that person even more directly. That's the ideal situation. But
Yep.
unfortunately, for a lot of us, we don't get to that point. It's because it's
Mhm.
hard to get a sponsor. It just
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
And you almost have to be in the right place at the right time with the right relationship. And then, of course, your work to speak very much for you
Mhm.
to get to that point.
Yep, absolutely. And it's really difficult for us as Black people inside of corporate America, right? Because oftentimes we're going in, and our representative is showing up, right? We
Yes.
code switch a lot,
Yes.
and it's for our own good. It's setting certain boundaries that I think are absolutely necessary for us to maintain ourselves.
Right.
But it's a very tiring and exhaustive state to be in, and sometimes that is something that can potentially hinder certain relationships from forming.
Right.
And sometimes that code switch is exactly what helps those relationships start to form. So,
Yeah.
it requires us to really be able to fill out who we're speaking with, who we're interacting with, how those interactions are landing upon them, who we feel like we can trust and actually be vulnerable with, who's actually recognizing us showing up, us doing the work, us actually getting the results, right? There's tons of different factors that we have to consider before we're even willing to, open ourselves up to a relationship with tons of people inside of the places that we work.
Right.
So it, like you said, it can be difficult, but it is something that is very rewarding,
Mhm.
if you take the time and you're able to sort of, strategically discern between the people that are there to actually help you and the people that are not.
And the caveat is the relationships, right? The caveat in the fact that you're not just forming connections. Anybody can just form connections. Obviously, LinkedIn and other social networks is say, "Hey, can we be connected?" That's all that is. But to actually have the relationship is key, and that relationship, more than likely, if it's a real relationship, takes time
Mhm.
to be able to get there. I mean, um, uh, it's going to be steps.
Mhm.
We can say that times there's going to be baby steps, but there's going to be times when it's going to be chunks, and you have to have the relationship and to get ready. But I think, even more so, we need to talk about, and I'm talking about at large, just people looking for referrers. And there are people who are looking and scanning because there's a benefit on the other side. Is that more than likely somebody's going to refer, they're going to get paid for referring someone else.
Mhm.
So keeping in mind that also what you talk about and the way you present yourself online and in person and other places is going to be contingent upon hitting those people who will be willing to say, I could speak for this person because he has what we call a proof,
Hmm.
and proof that you can actually do the job. It's somebody that can refer you. They're going to look for proof that you could do it because their reputation's on the line too.
Yep.
And as and being black is not going to just even honestly, let's just be candid. They're going to be black people even more scrupulous,
Mhm.
scrutinizing about who they refer because that our reputation has come very hard earned if it's a good one.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. People are putting their neck on the line if they refer you. So it's very imperative that if someone does refer you, that you show up and you show up correctly, because you are things like user experience and user design, right? You
Mm-hmm.
need to develop a portfolio there and have that online. But our online presence is becoming increasingly important because it's the thing that helps show with that social proof. And we need people to provide us things like recommendations on LinkedIn, because once again, again is social proof that you are who you say you are, that you do what you say you do, and that can really help persuade people to actually make the case for you, and refer you to their company for different roles. So yeah, 100%. I think that's important. Anyone who knows me from any of the other things that I'm on, I'm big about having receipts, right?
Yeah,
I have receipts for
absolutely.
everything that I accomplish when I'm in a role, to make sure that I can do my performance management review correctly, that I can
Mhm.
advocate for myself, the raises, the promotions, the things that I want. But then even outside of that, right, the social proof, in the sense of like with me in this current business, right? I have clients who will vouch for me. I have recommendations on certain platforms. You can see my work in different places. I try to make sure that there's receipts to back up anything that I'm saying I can do, and that's imperative when you're trying to actually land that referral.
Yes, I completely agree. And let's take a little left turn because I think it's very important to talk about the hidden job market and how it affects Black people.
Mhm.
And I think it's very important to understand, um, you know, because a big deal is often made from it, and very often, I remember from the last recession. That a lot of people, especially Black people, were affected by it because they would go, "You need to find out what the hidden job market is." So, well, where is it? Where are people hiding these jobs at? And I've had a problem with that particular term
Mhm.
of calling it hidden because really nobody's not hiding jobs. They're just not where you can find it on the mainstream. It's sort
Mhm.
of like, when Papa had a brand new bag back in the day with James Brown, it was played on R&B radio. That doesn't mean the song didn't exist. It's just found on R&B radio.
Mhm.
So the same thing applies is that the jobs and the jobs that do exist, but they're just not found on Indeed, Career
Mhm.
Builder, and Monster and all those other job boards. They're found maybe on the site,
Mhm.
in relationships, possibly not even created yet, waiting for you to create it. But
Mhm.
all of that, having to say that, the way that a lot of those jobs even are accessed are somewhat in the bias realm. Because let's say and I gave an example of this in an article last summer, is that I remember working in management in this particular company. They said, well, we're not going to advertise the job. We're just going to put it in the free resources that are in the neighborhood. The free resources in the neighborhood is downtown Chicago. You know who lives in downtown Chicago? You know how expensive downtown Chicago is? I think you get the picture. But all
Mhm.
of that is saying that you have to black job seekers have to go far and wide to find those jobs as opposed to somebody who lives in that area. If you're black, you get access to it. That's great. But if it's 90%, not black
Yeah.
in that particular area, they're not going to have access to those particular jobs.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And so speak directly to your point, right? I'm going to
it,
go back to the
uh,
overall hidden job market, but
okay.
directly to your point. If a company or organization is intentionally only marketing positions and roles in places that do not reach Black audiences or
Mm-hmm.
Latino audiences. Honestly, while it could be a very great role and it could be a good opportunity for your career, I would question if that's a company that you'd actually end up wanting to work at
I agree.
anyway. Right.
I
So for
totally
me, sometimes I think they're doing us a favor by not marketing them in those places, simply because you're going to get there. You're going to end up being uncomfortable or made uncomfortable. People are not going to want you to show up as your full self. Right. And oftentimes, what does that lead to? That leads once again to us being let go from those roles.
right.
So I often talk to people about allowing the process to sometimes weed out companies as much as companies weed out you. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So there's certain things like if a company or organization does not want to hire you because you have natural hair, odds are you
Move
probably
on.
don't want to work at that company or
Right.
organization anyway. All
Right.
right. So allowing them to weed themselves out, I think, is very, very important for us because it allows us to find spaces where we can actually live, exist, and thrive as our own selves. And I think oftentimes that's been very difficult for us to find. So in those instances, can you go and search in those places? And yes, and absolutely, if that's your cup of tea and that's where you're looking to be, and that major company is that's where they're only doing it, sure, by all means. Right, but at the end of the day, I try to make sure I guide people when I'm coaching so they find a sense of belonging at a place,
Mm-hmm.
and in places that are not intentional in the way that they recruit, they are more than likely not retentional in the way, intentional the way that they retain employees and the way that they engage their Black and brown employees, and so therefore you're going to have a much more difficult time at that type of company than you would
Mm-hmm.
one who's trying to at least be mindful of where they can actually access, Black professionals, and actually recruit them, and actually have a talent pipeline from different places, right?
Yeah.
So it's sort of a double-edged sword, if you will. All right, but I think
It may be.
sometimes those companies are doing exactly what what they meant to do,
Mm-hmm.
and that sometimes means that actually is saving you a headache, personally.
Now the other part of it is that you get someone like the Wells Fargo CEO this
Mhm,
past summer. If you
mhm,
remember correct, he was just saying, "Well, we can't find Black talent,
mhm,
but yet your marketing is not where the Black talent is."
mhm, mhm,
And this is where the distinction is that you willing to spend the money to send your recruiters or recruiter team or your relationships or whatever to Northwestern University, to Ohio State University, where there's 3 to 10 to 15% Black, maybe, or you could send him to Florida A&M, send him to Chicago State, send him to the smaller Black colleges where there
mhm.
are Black people. And what I'm saying is that each year you hear people say, well, we want diversity. We're all about diversity. We look at the same pictures that have been there up on the website that show none of us or very few of us. And yet you're saying that there's no diversity, but you got to kind of go to where the diversity is
Yeah.
in order to get the diversity. But you're willing to spend 3 times the money that it will charge that you would for a much smaller historically Black college or university. I mean, it's sort of having it both ways. Understanding your point too, if you really want to work at that company that doesn't represent you, go ahead. But I think what the turn is now is that the modern job search is you finding places that value you, and that there is a relationship going in, and that there's a business relationship going in.
Yeah.
That is not that there's just a hierarchy, but you value my opinion and you value who I am, and that in return also will help your clients that you do value those Black lives and those and that kind of diversity, and they're going to be looking for you. And we found out as well that there are some companies that are willing to say, it
Mhm.
won't work for us.
Yeah, that Wells Fargo is situation is very interesting for me, simply because
But he said something that but a lot of companies feel that way, right?
Yeah, and I have one word for that: delusional.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and what I mean
Yeah.
by that, and the reason I say this is because I literally, concurrently, as this situation was happening, I was working with one of his Black leaders who actually was helping to try and figure out the strategy for some of this. So like concurrently, right? So it's a point of delusion. That's what it really comes down to. And if a leader at an organization is that delusional when it comes to sourcing Black talent, then I believe that their delusion would probably extend to actually developing Black talent and promoting Black talent inside of their organization. As this old saying goes, a fish rots from the head down, right? Yes. So if you have a leader that is that delusional, odds are the rest of the organization is taking up a very similar stance when it comes to that, and you're going to have a much harder time as a Black person in that organization navigating those waters and actually promoting yourself or getting yourself promoted to the positions that you actually want to get to. Yeah. And that's just even evident in Wells Fargo's practices and the way they were taking advantage of Black people in the economic crash in 2008. It's clear that as a leader, that organization has clearly taken a stance that is very similar to what you're saying right here, and something that we know is literally the opposite effect. Yeah. So yeah, for me, I think those are very good signs for us. I think that tells me I stay away from Wells Fargo.
Yes.
Until Wells Fargo can tell me and show to me that they have made a change, that they have actually tried to diversify their talent acquisition pipeline, that they are maybe donating and actively being involved in some of the causes that actually care about me and my life, that they start to actually have leadership that reflects what I look like and who I am, then maybe I shouldn't be working at that institution. That's just simply put.
Agreed.
And so that's easier said than done, right? We know that the majority of institutions are headed by white people. The boards are white people. Major leadership is white people. But that's not to say you will not find a company that is actively trying to make changes, right? And I think that's where you want to try to find, that's where you want to try to be when you are someone who is, aspiring to move up in your career, right? One thing we know, so the Center for Talent Innovation put out a report of being Black in corporate America. And the one thing that we know is that from that data, that Black professionals are overwhelmingly more ambitious than their white counterparts when it comes to their careers, right? But if you put yourself in a predicament where you're working at a company like Wells Fargo, odds are you're not going to make it very far, even with that ambition. And now, honestly, that ambition might get crushed where you are. So it's really imperative, like you said, the tides are shifting, but it's imperative that we really start to find companies that are exhibiting the values that they speak. Right. It's easy to say anything about Black people. We want more Black people. We're diversifying our pipeline. But if you do not see them in the places that you frequent, odds are they aren't diversifying very much. They haven't actually taken the time to get to know the market. They haven't actually taken the time to get to know where the market typically is, how to access that market. So I think it's part of it is we have to be a little bit more vigilant in who we're applying to, where we want to work. If we're trying to actually find places that are willing to, number one, see us as full human beings. Number two, allow us to show up as those full human beings. And number three, want to see us succeed as much as we want to succeed. Right. And I think that is something that is really hard. Now, back to the other point, the hidden job market.
Okay.
That goes back to what we were talking about earlier. The majority of the jobs that are hidden, like you have a good fraction that is what you just mentioned, right? They'll say, okay, they have to post it somewhere and they have to advertise it because some state laws and things of that sort in most cases. So they'll post it in those little, local areas, and they'll make sure that, the right people see it. Right. Okay. I would say that's a decent sliver, but the majority of the quote unquote hidden job market are going to be roles that aren't directly posted to those sites that you talked about, those Indeeds, those LinkedIns, right? And you mentioned a couple of good ways to sort of avoid that. I always tell people, if you really want to work at a certain company, make sure to visit their website, look at their actual job board to see what's going on. The other thing is you need to make connections with people, because sometimes there's internal postings that they have that they're looking to fill with an internal candidate, but they're having an issue with, clearly, because it's still posted. And so maybe you can get some insight. Maybe that person can refer you, say, hey, I have a really good candidate. They're outside, but I got a really good candidate. Right. So it goes back to making those connections and expanding your network and developing those relationships with the right people before you actually need them. So you're actually able to utilize them and leverage them to get your foot in the door. Because like you said, the majority of the hidden job market is really about that networking and referrals piece than anything. And that really does put us at a disadvantage, because usually we are not as privy to those networks and those circles.
Yeah, I think it also comes down to being able to measure the candor of the feedback that you get. If you're able to ask people, especially within the interview process, or somebody has to do with the interview process, so, well, I notice there's not a lot of diversity in your company. How candid are they? If you feel like they're being superficial, just trying to sell you a bag of goods, then you probably need to detour. If they are giving you the candor, then maybe that might be a consideration. But very often it has to do with the candor, right? It has to do with the honesty that they're willing to give when you're asking the direct questions and they're deferring, and it's always not a direct comeback. It's not always a yes or no, or say, yes, we failed in this area, but we're doing this, or things like that. Then that's also kind of a warning sign. Even during the recruitment process, if the recruiter can't answer that question, then I think you need to start holding either the recruiter feet to the fire, or you said, no, thanks, I need to work somewhere else, because obviously you don't understand, they don't get it. It would just be a source of frustration for me.
Yeah, no, 100%. That goes back to the point I made about sort of discerning for ourselves, right? We have to ask the right questions. We have to sort of do a little bit more we need to do bigger research, or more research into a company or organization, what they're actually doing. And like you said, if a recruiter can't answer that question for you, then what that says to me is that any diversity initiatives that company may have are null and void at that point, because if it hasn't made it down to the people that are recruiting talent, then odds are it's not something that is a very big priority inside of that company. Because if it's a priority inside of that company, pretty much anybody who works in that company should be able to talk to you about it. They know how to get that information out, and they know how to make that very clear and very apparent inside of these organizations. And if they haven't done that, then I'd really ask, I'd really take a really hard look to see if they're actually, practicing the words that they preach.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important piece for another particular reason, is that this will also affect you, even before you get in the company. This is going to affect how they look at you and what the expectations are before you come in the company. You're asking those questions, they're willing to hire you, but it will be a doubt that maybe, or the fact that they don't particularly, and I'm not saying that they do or they don't. I think they need to be upfront and very candid again about what the history looks like, and why we don't see many of us on the board, or many of us in the management positions. But just to understand, you'll need to do a lot of that work for them going in. Not necessarily tell them that you've done the work, but you want to listen to how up front, like saying that the last candidate they had, the last person they had for that job was a Black person. You may need to go back and talk to that person, and that should be a part of your discernment. Talking to who's the last employees and what intel can they give me. I'm not saying that's always possible, but I think there might be a consideration that some people, they leave for a particular reason,
Hmm.
And you might want to find out where that, and I'm just trying to give people some guidance as to what they could be and should be researching
Yeah, one hundred
as
percent.
we talk about this. But I think even talking to the last people, the people who are working internally, and see who's working with the other departments, see how they view and research things like that. And I don't think there's a right and wrong. I think it's wrong when you don't research at all. That's where
Yeah,
we get it wrong. Or you're just researching just enough to say that you're familiar with something. You've got to dig. We got to dig a little bit deeper
yeah,
in
yeah.
order to get the right information.
Yeah, 100%. One of the questions that I like to ask in interviews is, can you shed a little light on how this position became available? Right. So, because I always want to sort of know, like, is this a revolving door? Right? Are people constantly making their way out of this position?
Mhm.
Now, when you say talk to people who held that position before, I want to make sure I make very clear here. Do not ask the company who held this position
Right.
prior.
Yeah.
Right? Do not do that. People will take that advice and try to run with that. But
Now, every
go
now
on
and then they do
LinkedIn.
volunteer. They
Now, sometimes
volunteer
they
a
do.
little bit.
Yeah,
Every
if
now
they,
and then. Every
I'll
now
take
and
any
then.
information you volunteer,
But
100%.
more than likely, they're not going to just give it up. Right.
Yeah, and they shouldn't. I'm pretty sure that will be an illegal thing to do.
Right.
But you can go to LinkedIn. Most times, most professionals, for the most part, come and update their LinkedIn when they get new jobs. So you typically can go and see who's worked at these companies, who's held those positions, and then what I typically do, and this goes back to the networking piece. Sort of when you're trying to establish those relationships, one of the first things that I like to do is an informational interview with people,
Hmm.
right? And so you could do the same thing with someone who's worked at excuse me, someone who's worked at that company.
Hmm.
There's certain things that you could, really ask them to just really get a better understanding of, what the job was like. How did they like it? What were some of the things they were doing? Ask them about certain trends, insights, advice, resources, assignments, things like that that can really
Right.
help you. And that's actually a framework called the TR framework. It actually comes from this book, The 2 Hour
Oh,
Job Search.
yeah, good, good,
Um, but yeah, so there's like a whole framework for these informational interviews that can help give you some more insight into the company and the organization. And that harkens
Mhm.
back to the point that you were talking about before, is really figuring out, do I want to work here? Is this a position I want to hold? Is this actually what I want to do? Right? Figuring that out before you actually, get into the role is very important. Oftentimes what I think we do is read a job description and we think that's exactly what the role is going to be. And 9 times out of 10, that job description is not very accurate when it comes to the actual role. So it's important that we talk to people that actually hold these positions, that actually have worked in these companies, to really get the scoop on what's going down there, to make a better assessment for ourselves on if we believe this could be a good fit for us.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree with you. Thank for even clarifying that even more. You know, I really want to, just make sure that people are understanding, everybody's watching, everybody's interested in finding out why the Black job search is different for us than everybody else, is that the representation often isn't there in those companies. And very often the whole culture and our whole day is contingent on how that company will treat Black people. Is there's a lot of us who have been the only ones, and the things that we hear that come out of people's mouths when it comes to our race, our color, the stereotypes are very damaging and very hurtful in history. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't that company that's out there you didn't have that experience. Okay, a lot of us had that experience, and a lot of us had those bosses, and a lot of us who had that, and we have to manage up very often. And it's not always the most comfortable way of going about business every single day.
Mhm.
So I just want to make that clear that this is something that's a little bit different because it's been looked at differently. I mean, if you don't believe it, look at the diversity within your company. And
Mhm.
if it's less than 10%, there's a major, major problem, especially when the people who are graduating very often. I want to give a shout out again to Christopher Taylor. Thanks for commenting. And Juanetta and my boy Roderick Lewis. What's up? He said very true, I guess, to everything that we've said. So, so The last piece of this that we'll have in this discussion, Lord knows we can go on for another couple hours about it, is for the fact that there's also the idea of professional development and some of the organizations that we need to be involved in and find our ways to have a voice in, because very often in some industries, that's where you'll find out where the leads and the job creation really is, because you begin to be on the front end of the, you're in those committees, you're in those organizations, then you will get to see some of those developments first, and that's a great opportunity to be on that floor and to be among the first, no matter who it is. But
Mhm.
very often we come in and we don't take advantage of those opportunities. And you can even go do that to a new organization you join. Look for the opportunities and the ways and the conversations where you can be on the floor of those ideas and then come up with those ideas and even have a voice in those particular ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. So if you're inside of a company, you can look at the ERGs, right, the employee resource groups and
Mm-hmm.
things to really get a better understanding and also help the company improve in those certain areas. And also, that's a great way to start developing relationships with certain leaders, because they also often usually have executive leadership sponsors and things of that sort. So you can start to develop those relationships. If you're not necessarily with a company or organization right now, or even if you are, consider looking into some of the organizations that are out there, professional organizations that are out there, like the National Association of Black Journalists, or
Mm-hmm.
the National Society of Black Engineers. We can, the National Black MBA Association, things like that, because if you are in those organizations, you can get number one, you start to build a network of people who are doing similar things as you, so they can help you when you're trying to transition into different places. Also, often you can get better insight to which companies or organizations are actually strategically trying to source Black people, right? They want you to be there because oftentimes they are making connections, they're having partnerships, they're sponsoring things that these organizations are doing. So if they're actively putting their money where their mouth is by sponsoring these organizations, by showing up when these organizations have job fairs and things of this sort, that's a great place to start to really understand, what companies or organizations might actually be trying to walk the walk instead of just talk the talk.
Yeah, I agree. And if you're a recruiter as well, there
Mm-hmm.
are conferences that you can actually go to. Now that everybody's online, it's probably even easier to get a hold of or to be a part of those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
You can get to organizations and conferences like, and I'm going to pull up a list like this. If you're trying to recruit particularly Black people, I actually wrote an article for Ripple Match, a client that I had a while ago. Some of the organization, Afrotech, is one place where a recruiter can find more Black talent, especially in tech. And that's actually, Blavity has a lot to do with that. And I'm sure some of you, but you can research that, as well as the National Society of Black Engineers. That's another organization where you could find those, and again, tech, engineering, anything STEM is very often something that is, that is. There's a lot of Black people, a lot of Black talent, but they don't have a lot of recruiters coming to those conferences. And Ben, some of them do, and there's a lot of them that don't. And that's also one I think is still Black is Tech. I know they had 2020 conferences. I don't know uh, how they've pivoted, but for those again who are recruiting, you can get that opportunity to find Black talent there and to solve some of the issues that you have with finding Black talent. Tristan, did you want to add anything before we're at the top of the hour? And I want to be sure we get everything that we can in this discussion, at least. But anything you want to add?
No, honestly, I think we touched on pretty much everything I would have brought up in the conversation. So I really appreciate you having me here and sort of sparking this conversation.
Right. And that's Tristan Layfield of Layfield Resume Consulting. at layfieldresume.com. Thank you very much for joining us on the Voice of Job Seekers. Of course, you can join us every couple of weeks on the podcast. Tomorrow will be another great episode. This particular episode will be on in March. Or late February, one of the two. I believe it's going to be late February. So I definitely want you to be part of that, and also download, listen, review if you like. And you can also get in touch with both of us through our LinkedIn profiles. Tristan Layfield, Mark Anthony